The first time Isabella Rossi saw him, she didn't know his name. She didn't know he controlled half of the eastern seaboard's underground empire. She didn't know men whispered his name the way they whispered prayers, quietly, desperately, hoping he wouldn't hear. She didn't know that the man who stepped between her and a barrel pointed at her face on that rainy Thursday night in Manhattan had a family crest carved into the walls of 3 continents. She didn't know her father had spent the last 20 years hunting him. She didn't know her blood and his blood were soaked into the same soil, just from opposite sides of the same war. All she knew in that alley was that he was beautiful. Dangerously, impossibly beautiful. And that the moment his eyes met hers across the chaos, cold, dark, unreadable, something inside her shifted. Something she would spend years trying to undo. His name was Damian Volkov. And he wasn't just the wrong man. He was the man her father had sworn, on the grave of every Rossi who came before her, to destroy. By the time Isabella learned the truth, she had already memorized the way his voice sounded when he said her name. She had already let him past every wall she'd spent a lifetime building. She had already fallen, completely, irrevocably, past the point of any clean exit. And the moment her family found out, the bloodshed didn't just begin. It erased everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and the price of both. Isabella Rossi did not believe in dangerous men. She believed in deadlines, black coffee, and the particular silence that only exists in library stacks at 2 in the morning. She believed in the stack of translation contracts on her desk, each one a different language, a different world she could visit without ever having to leave the safety of her Manhattan apartment. She was 28 years old and had never once stepped inside her father's world. That was the deal. That had always been the deal. Marco Rossi, restaurateur to Manhattan's elite, philanthropist, respected patriarch, had kept his 2 worlds surgically separate. The world he showed Isabella was clean and warm. Sunday dinners. The smell of her late mother's tomato sauce drifting from the kitchen. A father who kissed her forehead every time she walked through the door like she was still 12 years old and he could still protect her from everything. The other world, the one with locked rooms and men who never made eye contact and phone calls that drained the color from her father's face, had no door Isabella was allowed to open. She had never asked to. She had a life. Small, precise, and carefully constructed. Her apartment on West 72nd. Her clients. Her best friend Celeste, who dragged her to rooftop bars she never wanted to attend and kept insisting that fluency in 6 languages was no substitute for actually talking to people. You use languages to hide, Celeste told her once. You know that, right? Isabella hadn't argued. She'd poured more wine and changed the subject. She was exceptional at that, redirecting. Maintaining a careful professional distance from anything that felt too large, too loud, too real. She had learned early that the safest place to stand was slightly outside your own life, where you could observe without being consumed. Which was exactly why what happened the night of October 14th made no sense at all. She'd been walking home from a late contract pickup. Rain, sudden and cold, the kind the forecast had promised wouldn't materialize. She'd cut through Dalton Alley, her usual shortcut, headphones in, manuscript pages tucked under her arm. She heard the voices before she saw them. 3 men. One she didn't recognize. One with a scar along his jaw. One holding something she chose not to look at directly. She stopped. They hadn't seen her yet. And then the man with the scar turned, and he had. Isabella didn't scream. Didn't run. Her body simply stopped working entirely, the way bodies do when fear bypasses rational thought. Then a 4th figure appeared at the far end of the alley. He didn't run. Didn't shout. He walked, slowly, deliberately, with the particular calm of a man who has never once been uncertain of his authority in any room he entered. He said something she couldn't hear. Whatever it was, it worked immediately. The 3 men left without a word. The alley went quiet. The man who'd saved her, tall, dark-suited, with eyes that caught the street lamp light and held it, looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked away without offering a hand, without asking if she was okay. He simply disappeared into the dark at the alley's end. Isabella stood in the rain, her manuscripts bleeding ink, her heart doing something entirely new and entirely unwelcome inside her chest. She didn't know his name yet. But somewhere deep in the part of her that translated meaning for a living, she already knew with absolute certainty. This was not over. She saw him again 4 days later. This time it wasn't an alley. It was the lobby of the Marchetti building, all marble floors and cathedral ceilings and men in suits worth more than most people's monthly rent, where Isabella had been hired to provide live Italian translation for a private acquisitions meeting. She'd arrived early, the way she always did. Taken her position near the glass partition. Opened her notebook. Let the room settle around her into the professionally invisible arrangement she'd perfected over years. And then he walked in. She recognized him before she could stop herself. The posture. The silence he carried with him. The specific way a room rearranged itself around his presence without anyone openly acknowledging that was what was happening. He didn't look at her. He took a seat at the far end of the conference table, flanked by 2 men who existed purely to be large and intimidating, opened a folder, and did not look up. Isabella told herself she wasn't watching him. She was doing her job. Her job required her to monitor the room. He was in the room. Logic. The meeting proceeded the way these meetings always did, voices layered over voices, deals wrapped in courteous language that meant other things entirely, the particular choreography of powerful men performing reasonableness at each other. Isabella translated. Precisely. Neutrally. The way she always did. And then one of the men across the table said something in Italian that had nothing to do with the acquisition. It was about the woman in the corner. Isabella kept her expression completely blank. She translated the words that were meant to be translated. Let the other words sit in the air where she'd collected them. When the meeting ended, she packed her notebook and stood. You understood all of it. She turned. He was standing 2 feet away. She hadn't heard him approach, which meant he'd moved deliberately quietly, which meant he'd been watching her long enough to plan this. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Measured. Every word chosen with the same precision she applied to her own work. That's what I'm paid for, she said. The parts you didn't translate. She looked at him directly. She'd been practicing looking at him directly since the alley, because every instinct she had warned her that meeting his eyes was a form of declaration she wasn't prepared to make. Those parts were unprofessional and irrelevant to the contract, she said. Something moved in his expression. Not a smile, too controlled for that. But something adjacent to it. The shadow of one. Damian Volkov, he said. He extended his hand. She looked at it 1 beat longer than was polite. Isabella Rossi, she said. And she shook it. His grip was firm. Brief. The handshake of a man who understood that physical contact with him was not a neutral act. He nodded once and walked away. She stood at the edge of the emptied conference room and told herself that the name meant nothing. Volkov. She told herself the slight elevation in her pulse was caffeine. She told herself that the way he'd noticed she'd heard everything, and chosen not to expose her for it, meant nothing at all. She was a translator. She translated things. She did not fall for strangers who appeared in alleys and disappeared into boardrooms. But that night, for the first time in years, Isabella couldn't sleep. He hired her. 3 days after the Marchetti meeting, an envelope arrived at her agency. Private contract. A week of translation work, Italian, Spanish, French. Negotiations, documentation, correspondence. The client was listed as DV Holdings. She almost declined. She drafted the refusal email twice. Both times she deleted it before sending. Celeste, reading over her shoulder, said, you are absolutely going to take this. Isabella took it. The work brought her to a townhouse in the West Village, 4 stories, security cameras at every corner, men positioned at the entrance who were clearly not doormen. Inside, there were ordinary rooms and rooms that were clearly not ordinary, and Isabella moved through her designated spaces with the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned long ago that noticing too much was a professional liability. Damian was almost never in the same room with her. Almost. He appeared at the edges of things. At the end of a corridor while she finished a call. At the library door while she worked at the reading table. Never speaking first. Never explaining his presence. Just there, briefly, like a question she hadn't been asked yet. On the 4th day, he sat across from her. No preamble. He placed a document in front of her, handwritten, Italian, dense with legal language, and said, I need the precise meaning. Not a translation. The meaning. She looked at the document. Then at him. There's a difference. That's why I hired you. She read it carefully. Read it again. And then she told him what it actually said, not the surface words but the architecture of intention beneath them. The places where the language had been designed to obscure rather than reveal. The thing the person who wrote it was actually trying to accomplish. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, How did you know? Because I speak the language, she said. Not just the words. He was quiet for a moment. You grew up here. Born here. My father is Italian. My mother was French. Was. She died when I was 12. She didn't know why she said that. She didn't volunteer that information to anyone. Something shifted fractionally in his expression. A seam in the control. Barely visible, but there. I'm sorry, he said. It didn't sound like a politeness. It sounded like he meant it. They sat in that library for another hour. He asked questions, about language, about meaning, about the difference between what people say and what they intend. She answered, and somewhere in the answering she stopped feeling like she was at work. Walking home that evening, she ran the conversation through her mind the way she ran translations, examining for subtext, for the thing beneath the surface layer. What she found there frightened her. He hadn't been asking about language. He had been asking about her. And she had answered every question. Every single one. She walked faster. Told herself it was professional assessment. Told herself a man like that was simply determining whether she was trustworthy. But she kept hearing the way he'd said I'm sorry, like loss was something he understood personally. Like underneath everything, the silence, the men at the door, the room she wasn't allowed to enter, there was a wound he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. She was in trouble. She just didn't know yet how deep it went. It happened on a Thursday evening. A multi-party conference call had run 2 hours over schedule, leaving Isabella stranded by a sudden rain that came out of nowhere. She'd decided to wait it out in the library rather than get soaked. She was sitting in the leather chair by the window, her work notes closed in her lap, watching the rain streak the glass, when she heard the door. Damian. Without his jacket. The first time she'd seen him without it. White shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow. He looked, she searched, as she always did, for the precise word, reduced. Not diminished. Reduced. Like the version of himself he maintained for rooms full of people had been quietly set aside. He stopped when he saw her. I didn't know you were still here. The rain, she said. He nodded. Moved to the side table. Poured 2 glasses of something dark without asking and placed one within her reach before settling in the chair across from hers. They sat in silence for a while. It was the first silence between them that wasn't professional, not punctuated by documents or the specific contractual purpose of her presence. Just silence. And it was unbearable in the best possible way. You don't like this house, he said finally. I didn't say that. You don't have to say things. You're a translator. She almost smiled. It's a beautiful house. It just doesn't feel like anyone lives in it. He was quiet for a beat. No one does. The simplicity of that, said without self-pity, as plain fact, landed somewhere in her chest and stayed there. Where do you live? She asked. He looked at her as though it was a strange question. Like no one had asked him that before. I manage my world, he said. I don't live in it. She understood that more than she wanted to admit. Hadn't she done the same thing? Managed her life from a careful distance, fluent in every language except the one that required you to simply be present? My mother used to say that people who don't let themselves live, Isabella said slowly, are usually protecting something. The room went completely still. He looked at her, really looked, without calculation, without the particular assessment of a man who is always evaluating risk. Just looked. What are you protecting? He asked. The question came back at her like a mirror. She didn't answer. But she didn't look away either. They sat with it, the unanswered question suspended between them like the last note of a song neither of them could finish, until the rain slowed and Isabella rose to gather her things. At the door she turned. He was still sitting in the dark, glass in hand, watching her. Damian, she said. His name in her mouth for the first time, not as a professional address but as itself. It felt like crossing a line she had been standing at the edge of for weeks. Good night, Isabella, he said. She left. Outside, the wet street caught the lamplight. Her heart was doing that new thing again, the thing she still didn't have a word for. She'd translated 40,000 words in a dozen languages and not one of them fit. She was falling. She could feel exactly how far she had already gone. And somewhere across town, in a meeting she didn't know was happening, in a room she would never be allowed to enter, her father was saying a name. Volkov. With a hatred she had never heard in his voice before. No one was supposed to know. That was the unspoken agreement between them, never discussed, never formalized, simply understood the way people who communicate in subtext understand things. What happened in the library existed only in the margins of the legitimate world, concealed inside contracts and conference calls and the plausible professional justification of her being there. He texted at unusual hours. Nothing romantic, questions. A word in Sicilian dialect he couldn't place. A phrase from an old document requiring verification. But at 11 at night. At 6 in the morning. She answered every time, quickly, and they both pretended not to notice what that meant. He started leaving books on the library table. Not as gestures, she was almost certain he told himself it wasn't a gesture. A collection of Montale. A French novel she'd mentioned once in passing. Always face down when she arrived, as though they'd been set there and forgotten, as though it was incidental. She read every one. He knew she would. On a Friday in November, he drove her home. It wasn't offered. It was stated in the tone of a man who had already decided and was simply informing her. Under any normal circumstances she would have declined on principle. She got in the car without a word. They drove through Manhattan at midnight, the city indifferent and luminous around them, and they talked. Really talked. About her mother. About the years of grief that had rearranged everything her family was. About how she had thrown herself into languages because language was the one place where you could make meaning make sense, where you could find order inside chaos. He told her about a garden. In Mexico. His mother's garden when he was 7 years old. Before everything changed. Orange trees. Morning light. A woman singing while she worked, unhurried, like she had all the time the world would ever offer. He said it without sentiment, clean, factual. But Isabella was fluent in the unsaid. She understood that this garden was the last place he had simply been a child. Before the world his father had built collapsed onto him and decided what he would be. When the car stopped outside her building she didn't move immediately. You don't have to be what you were made to be, she said. It wasn't planned. It arrived fully formed, the way truth sometimes did. He looked straight ahead. Jaw tight. A long silence. Then, some things, once decided, can't be undecided. By who? He turned and looked at her. In the dark of the car, with the city moving its indifferent brilliant life outside the glass, there was no professional distance. No contract. No plausible innocence between them. Just the two of them, closer than they'd ever been, and the specific gravity of a feeling neither of them was permitted to have. He didn't move toward her. But he didn't look away. "Go inside, Isabella," he said. Low. Almost gentle. She got out. Walked to her door without looking back. Unlocked it with hands that were entirely, stubbornly steady. Inside, she pressed her back against the door and breathed. She was completely, impossibly, terrifyingly in love with him. And she knew, the way she always knew the thing beneath the surface, that someone was going to find out. If you already feel this is something worth protecting, stay with us. Because so does someone who wants to destroy it. It was her brother who found out first. Nico Rossi, 3 years older, twice as reckless, and deeply embedded in the world Isabella had always been carefully shielded from, had been following her for 2 weeks. Not because he suspected anything romantic. Because he'd seen the DV Holdings contract on their father's desk and hadn't liked what those initials stood for. He photographed them through the townhouse window on a Tuesday night. Isabella, sitting across from Damian at the library table, laughing, actually laughing, unguarded and real, at something he had said. That was all it took. Nico didn't confront her. He went directly to Marco Rossi. Isabella found out when she arrived at her father's restaurant for their regular Sunday dinner and walked into a room that had gone completely silent. Her father stood at the head of the table. Nico was stationed by the window. 3 men she had recognized since childhood stood near the door with the specific stillness of people waiting for a decision to be made. Marco Rossi placed 2 photographs on the table. Isabella looked at them. "You're going to explain to me," her father said, very quietly, "what this is." She should have lied. She knew it even in the moment, a clean, precise lie, the way she managed difficult situations, the way she managed everything. But she looked at those photographs, at herself, genuinely happy in a way she hadn't known her face was still capable of, and she couldn't do it. "It's not what you're afraid it is," she said. "Wrong answer." Her father's voice didn't rise. It dropped. That was always the more frightening thing. "Damian Volkov," he said, "had my brother murdered. He destroyed the Rossi alliance in 2009. He took 3 territories that belonged to this family by blood. And you, my daughter, who I have protected your entire life, have been sitting in his house." The room felt like it had lost all its oxygen. "I didn't know," she said. "Now you know," her father said. "So you will end it. Tonight. Completely. And you will never go back." Isabella stood very still. The translator in her, the part that always listened for meaning beneath language, heard what her father was actually saying beneath the measured words. He was not asking. He was telling her that if she didn't comply, Damian Volkov was going to die. And it wouldn't be clean. "You can't. I have spent 30 years protecting you from this world," her father said. Each word precise and final. "Do not make that protection something I come to regret." She left the restaurant. Walked 4 blocks in the cold without a coat. Then she called Damian. He picked up on the second ring. She didn't say "my father knows." She didn't say "I've been told to end this." She said, "I need to see you." When she arrived at the townhouse he opened the door himself. He looked at her face, really looked, the way he always looked when the professional distance fell away, and something in his expression shifted. A bracing. The recognition of a man who has been expecting catastrophe long enough that he knows its face. "Tell me," he said. She told him everything. Standing in his entryway, coat still on, she gave him every word without softening a single one. He listened without moving. Without interrupting. When she finished, the silence between them was different from every silence they had ever shared. "Isabella," he said. Just her name. And everything in the way he said it felt exactly like a goodbye. He ended it before she could. That was the thing she would replay for years afterward. She had walked to that townhouse ready to fight, ready to say this isn't finished, we find another way, and he had already decided. "You need to leave," he said. Not the townhouse. Not the city. She needed to leave the country. He told her there was a position in Paris, international legal translation, prestigious, legitimate, real. He had arranged it through proper channels months ago. She could leave within the week. She stood in his library and stared at him. "You arranged it," she said. "Before tonight." The precision of that landed like a blade through the center of her chest. Before tonight. Before her father's restaurant. Before the photographs. Before any of this reached a crisis point. He had been building her an exit the entire time she was falling, quietly, methodically, without telling her, because he had always known exactly how this would end. "Because you knew," she said. "Because I always knew. What we were doing. What it would cost. And you didn't think I deserved to know." His eyes met hers. The control was entirely in place now, the version of him without fractures, without gardens in Mexico, without books left on tables in the dark. "You deserved better than the choice," he said. She wanted to cross the room and demand that he look at her the way he'd looked at her in the car that night. With the walls down. With the distance gone. With his eyes saying the thing his voice was disciplined enough never to say. Instead she said, "If I go, I'm not coming back." He said nothing. "Tell me not to go," she said. Steady. Direct. Every word deliberate. "If this means anything, tell me not to go." The longest silence of her life unfolded between them. And then, "Go, Isabella." She walked out. She didn't let herself break until she was 3 blocks away, in an alley not unlike the first one, the place where she'd first seen him emerge from the dark like a question she hadn't known to ask. She stood there in the November cold and understood, with the brutal clarity that only genuine devastation produces, that she was not leaving because her father had found out. She was leaving because Damian Volkov had decided she was a complication he refused to allow to become a casualty. He was letting her go to save her. And he was executing it so cleanly that she would never be able to prove it was love. She flew to Paris 11 days later. No goodbye. No final message. She packed her life into 4 suitcases and she left. What she did not tell him, what she had discovered only 4 days after that night in the library, alone in her apartment bathroom, staring at something small and plastic and world-altering, she kept to herself. Because he had made his choice. And she had made hers. She was not going to use the truth as leverage. She was not going to become the reason he stayed inside a world she was beginning to understand he had never wanted to inherit. She protected him the only way she had left. With silence. The plane lifted into the night sky. Paris bound. Isabella pressed her palm flat against the cold window glass and did not look down. 3 months later, in a quiet apartment near the Seine, a little girl came into the world with her father's stillness and her mother's eyes. Isabella named her Aria. And Aria Volkov Rossi knew nothing of war. 3 years passed. Damian Volkov did not become smaller after she left. That was what people expected, some visible contraction, some evidence carved into his surface. Instead he expanded. More territory. More authority. A silence around him so complete that even the men who served him for a decade stopped attempting to read him. He worked. He decided. He ruled. He did not sleep. Not fully. Not the way he'd slept, briefly, surprisingly, during those weeks when he had allowed himself to believe something. When there had been books left on tables and a woman who translated not just words but the intentions beneath them, and who sat across from him in the dark asking questions no one else had ever thought to ask. He told himself this was natural discipline. That he had always slept lightly. That it had nothing to do with anything. His second-in-command, Rafa, watched him for 6 silent months before saying a word. "You're running the operation like a man trying to outwork something he can't name." "Everything has a name," Damian said. Rafa didn't press. He wasn't paid to push past certain lines. In the second year, one of Damian's men, tracking a competing financial operation moving through Paris, sent back a routine surveillance report. Photographs. Locations. Standard documentation. Damian scanned it the way he scanned everything. Efficiently. Clinically. Turned a page. Stopped. The photograph was from a park near the Seine. Surveillance quality, grainy, taken at distance. A woman pushing a stroller along a gravel path, her back to the camera. He knew her before he saw her face. The posture. The specific economy of her movement. The way she held herself, like someone who had learned to take up exactly the space she needed and not 1 inch more. Isabella. He stared at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked at the date stamp. Then he counted backward, the way you count when you are hoping to be wrong about what the numbers are telling you. The world he had spent 3 years building around the deliberate absence of feeling developed its first crack. He closed the file. He opened it again 6 hours later. He looked at the stroller in the photograph. The angle was wrong. The child wasn't visible. He closed it. This time it took 8 hours to reopen. When he did, he called the operative in Paris directly. "The woman in the park," he said. "The child in the stroller." "Little girl," said the operative. "Somewhere around 2.5. The woman calls her." "Don't." His voice was entirely level. The voice of a man who had spent a lifetime mastering the management of catastrophic interior events. "How old?" he said. The operative gave his best estimate. 2.5. Possibly 3. The line went quiet. 3 years ago. November. The library. The night she had come to tell him something, and he had sent her away before she could finish. Before she could say whatever had been sitting in her expression when she walked through his door that night. Something he had been too focused on managing outcomes to read correctly. What hadn't she told him? What had she walked out of that house already knowing that he had not? He stood at his office window and looked at the city spread below, every territory his in every way that mattered, the full architecture of a kingdom built on the ruins of his own capacity for softness, and understood, with the particular devastation of a man who has never once been catastrophically wrong about anything important. That he had been catastrophically wrong about this. And that somewhere in Paris, a child was growing up in complete ignorance of his name. He flew to Paris on a Thursday. No announcement. No full team. Rafa, 1 car, and the particular quality of silence that descends when a powerful man is operating completely outside his own protocols, when he has stopped managing the situation and simply begun moving toward it. He didn't go to her apartment. Not yet. He went to the park. He sat on a bench at the far edge of the Fountain Plaza and he waited with the still, total attention of a man who has accepted that he has no leverage here. No strategy. Nothing to negotiate with except himself. She arrived at 10:30. Isabella. 3 years had done to her what real time does to strong people, clarified her. There was a quality to the way she moved now, the same familiar economy but with something harder underneath it. Something earned. She was pushing a stroller. Damian did not move. The child, dark-haired, with Isabella's cheekbones and a particular stillness to her small face that he recognized with a physical shock, was pointing at the pigeons scattered across the path. Saying something. Isabella answering in French, in the easy, intimate rhythm of a woman who has been having this exact conversation every morning for 2 years. He watched them for 9 minutes. Then he stood. Isabella looked up. She went completely still. The color didn't leave her face. That wasn't how she worked. Instead she became precise and contained, in the way she did when something threatened to be larger than the available space. "Damian," she said. His name in her mouth again. Still the same. Still felt like crossing a line. He looked at the child. The child looked back at him with the absolute, unself-conscious directness of a small person who has not yet learned that sustained eye contact is considered remarkable. "Her name," he said. Not a question. "Aria," Isabella said. The name arrived in his chest and detonated quietly. He looked at Isabella. "How long were you going to?" "I wasn't going to tell you." Her voice was level. A translation of something vast and complicated rendered into clean manageable language. "Because you made your choice. And I made mine. I was not going to use her as leverage against you." "Leverage," he repeated. As though the word were from a language he didn't recognize. "You sent me away," she said. "I sent you away because your father had 4 men stationed outside your apartment for 3 consecutive weeks," he said. "If I hadn't ended it when I did." "I know," she said. A silence. "You know," he said. "I figured it out. Eventually. It took me a long time." Her voice shifted, not softening exactly, but developing a seam the armor hadn't had before. "I know why you did it." The pigeons burst from the path in a sudden scattered mass and Aria laughed, full, unguarded, delighted, and chased after them 3 unsteady steps before stopping to look back at her mother. And then at him. Damian watched his daughter laugh for the first time and felt 3 years of controlled survival crack open at every joint he possessed. "I have been wrong about almost nothing in my life," he said. He looked at Isabella directly. "I was wrong about this." She said nothing. "Isabella." One step toward her. Just one. "I am not the same man who sent you away." She looked at him for a long time, the translator's look, reading for the thing beneath the surface. "You need to prove that," she said finally. "Not to me." Her eyes moved to Aria, who had abandoned the pigeons and was now studying a pebble with the total scholarly absorption of a small scientist. To her. She didn't let him in immediately. That was the thing he had to understand first, that there was no speech eloquent enough to stand in for 3 years. No single grand gesture that could absorb the weight of what had been lost. Isabella Rossi was a woman who translated meaning, and she had learned in the hardest possible classroom the difference between a man who was sorry for an outcome and a man who truly understood the architecture of what he had done. So she made him prove it in the small ways. He came back to the park the next morning. And the morning after. He sat on the same bench and waited, and on the 4th day, when Aria broke away from her mother and walked directly toward him with the confident totality of a small person who has simply decided something. Damian knelt on the gravel of a Paris park in a suit worth more than most men earned in a year. And said, very quietly, "Bonjour." Aria considered him with grave seriousness. Then she pointed at his watch. "Monter," he said. She repeated it, approximate, triumphant, delighted with herself. Isabella stood 10 feet away, arms crossed, watching her daughter make her own entirely independent peace with the man she herself was still deciding about. Something that had been sealed shut inside her chest for 3 years shifted, slowly, carefully, like a door that has been locked so long the hinges require patient attention. He spent a week in Paris. Returned to New York. Came back. He called. Not about logistics or arrangements. He called at 9 in the evening the way he'd once texted at unusual hours, with a question about something Aria had said that he couldn't place. A word she'd invented. A phrase between languages. The particular fluid vocabulary of a child growing up in the space between 2 worlds. Isabella answered every time. She knew what it meant. She had always been fluent in the unsaid. On a night in early spring, when Arya was asleep and the apartment was quiet and the city outside was doing its particular Parisian thing, impossibly beautiful in the dark, indifferent to human difficulty, he said. I spent 3 years building something I didn't want to live in. Because I believed the only alternative was your funeral. She was quiet. I was right about the danger, he said. Your father's men. My father and I have had that conversation, she said. He knows about Arya. He's made his peace with it. A pause. He's made his peace with a lot of things. And you? He said it carefully. The way you say the one thing you've been practicing saying. She turned. Looked at him across the kitchen table, two people who had been standing at the edge of something real for a very long time, separated by every possible obstacle the world could manufacture, still standing. I never stopped, she said. That's the honest answer. I tried. I built a whole life in the trying. But I never stopped. He crossed the space between them in 2 steps. He didn't speak. He took her face in both his hands, the hands of a man who had done things that could not be undone and had survived them and was now, precisely here, in this moment, asking to be something different from what he had been made to be. She let him. And in that quiet spring apartment, with Arya dreaming down the hall, and the city keeping its eternal indifferent luminous watch outside the window. 2 people who had never once been simply allowed to love each other. Finally did. There is a particular kind of love that arrives in the wrong season. Not the wrong person. Not a mistake. The wrong season, when the world is not ready for it, when the people carrying it are not yet who they need to be, when the cost of keeping it exceeds what either of them can pay in the moment of being asked. Damian and Isabella had that love. They paid for it in years. In distance. In a daughter who grew up for a time without a father's name, and a father who built an empire specifically to stop himself from feeling what that absence was costing him every single day. But the most important truth about wrong season love is this. If it's real, it waits. Not passively. Not conveniently. It waits the way living things wait, by surviving. By changing. By becoming something stronger than it was when the cold began. Damian dismantled the war piece by piece. It took 2 years and sacrifices that the kind of history written in blood would call significant. He came to Paris not as a king. He came as a man, carrying nothing except the truth of who he had finally learned to be without her, and the quiet unshakable intention to become someone worthy of the daughter who had pointed at his watch and trusted him immediately, the way children trust before the world teaches them not to. And Isabella, who had spent her entire life translating other people's words, finally said her own. Out loud. To him. To the wrong man who, in the end, was the only right one she had ever known. Some loves are forbidden because the world is not brave enough to hold them. Damian Volkov and Isabella Rossi were. And that made all the difference.